Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Thursday, August 29th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Israel launches a major assault on the West Bank. So early Wednesday, Israeli forces launched a huge attack on the West Bank that appears to be the largest Israeli operation in the territory since the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. So this is pretty significant. And the assault focused on northern areas of the West Bank, including Jenin, Tulkarm, and Tubas. And these cities were targeted by ground raids and airstrikes. So far, at least 10 Palestinians have been killed in this operation, and the Israeli military said that this could take several days. So this is still ongoing. It started early Wednesday. It started about the time I was posting yesterday's show. And when the attack started, Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said the West Bank must be dealt with the same way as Gaza, and he called for evacuating Palestinians. He wrote on X, quote, "We must deal with the threat just as we deal with the terrorist infrastructure in Gaza, including the temporary evacuation of Palestinian residents and whatever steps are required. This is a war for all terms and purposes, and we must win it," end quote. According to Haaretz, the Israeli military said that it might allow residents of the areas that it is attacking to leave, signaling that the military is considering ordering evacuations, what they've been doing in Gaza, moving people around. And of course, in Gaza, they still bomb the so-called safe zones, but these evacuation are ways to push the Palestinians out of the territory. And this is the West Bank. The West Bank, when it comes to the Israeli settlers, and not just the settlers, but the government. There's settlers in the government, but Netanyahu has been clear about his intention to annex the West Bank. This is the West Bank when we talk about the territory that Israel wants. The West Bank is really the big one, more so than Gaza. The West Bank is the big prize. So, when we see these military operations ramp up, I am sure that they are thinking, we could do something similar to Gaza here. Let's just obliterate the place and push the Palestinians out. So right now, a total of 10 Palestinians killed, and there were some airstrikes. I know 3 were killed in a strike on a car. We haven't seen any sort of really heavy bombing like we do see in Gaza, but there's the chance of this thing really ramping up, and hundreds, if not thousands, of Israeli soldiers invaded on the ground. So the Palestinian Ministry of Health has said that Israeli forces have besieged medical facilities in Jenin and obstructed the movement of vehicles. A spokesman for the Palestinian Red Crescent Society told CNN that getting to the hospital in Jenin is difficult. The picture we have here from Reuters, you see an Israeli armored vehicle in front of an ambulance. So the Al-Quds Brigade, which is the armed wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, announced that its fighters were confronting Israeli forces with heavy volleys of direct bullets, and they claimed that an Israeli drone was shot down. So far, as of this recording, I haven't seen any Israeli casualties in this thing yet. So amid Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, violence in the West Bank has soared since October 7th. Over 650 Palestinians have been killed by the Israeli military and settlers, including 150 children. Some members of Netanyahu's governing coalition are settlers themselves, as I just mentioned, and they have long pushed for the annexation of the West Bank. And, the real figure in this is Bezalel Smotrich. He's the finance minister, but he's also has this minister position in the defense ministry that puts him in charge of the West Bank, essentially makes him the occupation governor. And this is someone who has long been on record of wanting to push the Palestinians out of the West Bank, and that's who's in charge of expanding the settlements. So we've also seen a lot of new settlements approved to be built, land grabs, by the Israeli government in the West Bank. It's not just the settlers, it's also the government that is doing this. All right. The next one here, U.S. silent on Israel's West Bank assault. So this article is from Middle East Eye. The U.S. said that it was seeking clarity on Israel's objectives after its ally launched an offensive in the occupied West Bank, which Palestinian and Israeli media said was the largest such attack since the Second Intifada. A National Security Council spokesperson told Middle East Eye, quote, "We are in touch with Israeli officials to learn more about the operation. The United States supports Israel's right to defend itself against threats to its security. At the same time, they must do so in a way that limits civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure," end quote. I don't even know why they include that in their statement, considering Israel has not been doing anything to limit civilian casualties and infrastructure damage in Gaza. But anyway, so this article, points out that despite the breadth and magnitude of the offensive mirroring Israeli military operations during the Palestinian uprising of the early 2000s, the Biden administration has so far held off on publicly addressing the matter outside of responding to journalists. So they've only put out statements in response to journalists asking for them, which is interesting. I mean, it's they're staying quiet. And this is, as we recently went over, the U.S. is, of course, Israel's biggest supporter, provides most of their military equipment and weapons. So this is something that is being enabled by that U.S. military support. All right, so the next one here, Israeli drone strike kills 4 near Syria-Lebanon border. This article is from Jason Ditz. So on Wednesday, Israeli drones attacked a vehicle on the Syrian side of the Syria-Lebanon border on the Beirut-Damascus highway. The strike killed at least 4 people, according to reports. Among the slain was Faraz Qassem, a member of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. 2 additional PIJ members were killed, as was a Hezbollah member identified by that organization as Mohammed Taha. So there was no word from either PIJ or Hezbollah as to what the figures' roles were. Israel claimed that Qassem was a member of the PIJ operations division and claimed that he was responsible for recruiting and enlisting Palestinians into Hezbollah. So the car that was attacked was not carrying weapons, according to reports, and Israeli comments did not indicate why the car was targeted. So this is, again, on the Syrian side of the Syria-Lebanon border, but also part of the Israeli strikes against Hezbollah, it looks like. All right, so the next one here, Biden knew that the Gaza pier would undermine aid efforts. So President Biden ordered the construction of a temporary pier off Gaza despite concerns from the U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, that the project would undermine efforts to pressure Israel to allow more aid into the Strip via land crossings. And this is according to a report released by USAID's Inspector General. So the report said that multiple USAID officials had expressed concerns that the focus on the pier, quote, would detract from the agency's advocacy for opening land crossings, which were seen as more efficient and proven methods of transporting aid into Gaza, end quote. So if you remember at the time, when Biden ordered the construction of the pier, he did so during his State of the Union address. Aid companies, NGOs and the UN, these groups that are operating or trying to operate on the ground in Gaza, just called it a public relations stunt. Again, he announced it at his State of the Union, and they're saying, you had all these border crossings. At the time, I think it was just aid was coming in through Rafah and just a little bit through one of the southern, I forget the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is essentially very close to Rafah. It's where Egypt, Israel, and Gaza meet. And you had all these other border crossings close to aid. So the aid groups are saying, why are you going to build a pier when you could just pressure Israel to open more border crossings? And that's apparently what they were saying internally in the Biden administration as well. So it just goes to show, It was a total PR stunt from the beginning. And the Pentagon was also aware that using the pier in the eastern Mediterranean would be difficult due to weather conditions. The report said the Pentagon's guidelines for the pier, quote, stated its usage was weather dependent and that it could not operate in conditions beyond what is known as Sea State 3 or short and moderate waves. However, the Mediterranean Sea is often at Sea State 4 with significant winds and waves, end quote. So they also knew that it wouldn't be able to withstand the weather, and the weather did knock the pier out of service several times during its short-lived use off the coast of Gaza. The pier operated for only 20 days and delivered a fraction of the aid that U.S. aid said it meant to, due to the seas and the lack of a real plan to make delivery. You know, they didn't really have a mechanism for delivering the aid. The World Food Program was doing it at one point. They canceled it at another point after Israel launched a major raid and hit one of their warehouses. They eventually delivered, you know, the aid that was left on the pier that was kind of built up there. So just a total disaster. The pier was decommissioned on July 17th. And the report said that this failed project cost $230 million. And at one point, rough seas broke apart the pier. And the repair for that cost $22 million. So just a huge amount of money. And of course, there was also the risk of this thing escalating U.S. involvement in Gaza in this genocidal war, because you had U.S. troops operating right off the coast, making them potential targets for Hamas. And, you know, they had the authority to shoot back if they were shot at. So, you know, certainly a tripwire for U.S. escalation. So just a complete disaster, and apparently they were aware of all the problems before Biden made his big announcement. All right, so the next one here, Israel has bombed Gaza into 42 million tons of rubble. So this article is from Daniel Larison from his Substack, Eunomia, and he gets into about, you know, how the U.S. has sent more than 50,000 tons of weapons, but he also cites this Bloomberg report that says Israel has left more than 42 million tons of debris by bombing Gaza. So this is from the Bloomberg report. So far, Israeli airstrikes have left more than 42 million tons of debris across the Strip, according to the UN. That's enough rubble to fill a line of dump trucks stretching from New York to Singapore. Removing it all may take years and cost as much as $700 million. The task will be complicated by unexploded bombs, dangerous contaminants, and human remains under the rubble. The majority of the debris is destroyed housing, and its distribution across the Strip roughly mimics Gaza's population density before the war. So just to complete, you know, you think about digging out, cleaning up all the rubble. They mentioned unexploded bombs. That's going to be a real hazard. And the human remains that they're going to find. And, man, it's just a complete destruction. This is what 50,000 tons of weapons will get you. All right, so the next one here, Bedouin freed from Gaza returns to village targeted for demolition. So this article is from the Associated Press, and this is about Qad Farhan al-Qadi, the 52-year-old Bedouin who was freed from Gaza. He was taken captive by Hamas, and Israeli forces found him in a tunnel on Tuesday and got him out. So I actually made a mistake yesterday. I said that he was from Rahat, which is a Bedouin town, pretty big one in the Negev desert that is recognized by Israel. A lot of these villages are not recognized by Israel, and it turns out he's actually from one of these small villages that's not recognized by Israel and is targeted for demolition. So he returned home. He returned home to his village, Khurbat Karkur, on Wednesday. He had a very warm welcome from his friends and other people who live there. So since November, about 70% of the village's residents have been told the government plans to raze their homes because they were built without permits in a protected forest not zoned for housing, according to a lawyer representing them. Al-Qadi's family hasn't received a notice, but the looming mass displacement of this close-knit community has cast a pall on what has otherwise been a joyous 24 hours. So he was greeted by dozens of well-wishers on Wednesday, and a lot of media was there. Again, it just goes to show how the Bedouins are treated by the Israeli government. They always end up getting, the short end of the stick here. And the one casualty when Iran bombed Israel, when they launched all those missiles and drones at Israel, there was only one casualty, and it was a Bedouin girl in the Negev desert in one of these villages. And she was wounded pretty bad. She made it, but she was hurt pretty badly, a young girl. I forget exactly how old, but a child. So they just always get caught in the middle of this stuff. All right, so the next one here, Ukraine complains about escalation concerns. So Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said Wednesday that the biggest problem Kiev has faced in its war against Russia is the Western concern for escalation and the risk of provoking Moscow. So Kuleba said, quote, ever since the beginning of the large-scale invasion, the biggest problem Ukraine has been facing is the domination of the concept of escalation in the decision-making progress among our partners, end quote. So he's saying their biggest problem is this concern of escalation, this concern of this turning into World War III. And Kuleba's remarks came as Ukraine is pushing really hard for the U.S. to allow long-range strikes into Russian territory using U.S.-provided missiles, and Russia is warning very strongly against this. We saw Lavrov suggest that it could ignite World War III. Kuleba said, quote, the war is always about a lot of hardware, money, weapons, resources, but the real problems are always here in the heads, end quote. So throughout the war, what he's complaining about is that we've seen the U.S. and NATO rule things out, say, we're not going to do this, we're not going to do that. That risks provoking Russia too much. And some of those things have included arming Ukraine with tanks. That was one thing they weren't going to do. They ended up doing it. Giving them fighter jets. They said they didn't want to do that because Russia might perceive it as NATO directly entering the war. They ended up doing that. And then another thing, just recently, a few months ago, Biden gave Ukraine the green light to use U.S. weapons in Russian border regions. And then a couple months later, Ukraine invaded Kursk using U.S. weapons, armored vehicles, missiles, and bombs. So the escalation ladder is always, they're always climbing the escalation ladder. And the next big thing could be these long-range strikes. And Kuleba made these comments during a conversation with Polish Foreign Minister Radoslaw Sikorski, who expressed support for allowing Ukraine to launch long-range strikes with NATO weapons. Sikorski said NATO should, quote, let Ukraine fight with whatever it has, with whatever we have delivered them, and let's deliver them more, end quote. And if his name, Sikorski, sounds familiar, that's because he was the Polish official who thanked the U.S. for bombing the Nord Stream pipelines on the day of the sabotage attack. All right, so the next one here, the EU considers training Ukrainian troops inside Russia. So Politico reported on Tuesday that the EU has said it would consider a Ukrainian request for training soldiers inside Ukraine should the necessary political and operational conditions be met. So an EU External Action Service document from July that was obtained by Politico says that the EU would need to do more analysis on the idea of training soldiers in Ukraine, and it acknowledges that doing so would be provocative toward Russia and endanger the trainers. The document reads, quote, a further and more comprehensive analysis would be needed in order to fully assess the risks and possible mitigation measures, as well as political and operational advantages of conducting some training, end quote. The document said that it is highly likely that this would be viewed as a provocation by Russia, an EU military presence, and says that it's not feasible for the EU to protect its troops if they send them to Ukraine. So some EU countries have expressed support for sending trainers to Ukraine, including France. If you remember, not too long ago, Macron was pushing real hard for sending troops to Ukraine. He met with Zelensky in France back in June. Zelensky was in town for a D-Day event that Russia wasn't invited to. After Macron met with Zelensky, he said that he was going to finalize a plan to send troops to Ukraine for training, but it never materialized. So either his senses came to him, or he had somebody else in NATO, convince him not to do it. And there is, when we talk about this, it's important to point out that there is a small, unofficial NATO presence in Ukraine. A few dozen NATO Special Operations soldiers. We know there's British soldiers in Ukraine helping with targeting. But what Macron and other European countries have talked about is, an open deployment of, potentially a few thousand troops to train Ukrainians. So, that would be a whole nother escalation. But the EU is talking about it. This doesn't sound like it's something that's going to happen anytime soon. But goes to show that these conversations are happening about openly sending troops to Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, the Houthis allow the towing of a damaged oil tanker. So the Houthis have agreed to allow tugboats to reach the So Union, a Greek-flagged oil tanker that's anchored in the Red Sea that was struck by Houthi missiles last week. So this ship was disabled by the Houthi strike and is reportedly still on fire. A French destroyer rescued the 29-person crew of the ship in the aftermath of the attack, and they were taken to Djibouti. Iran's mission to the UN said on Wednesday that the Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, agreed to let the tanker be towed after several requests. So Iran said that the Houthis agreed to a temporary ceasefire to let the tanker be towed away. But a Houthi spokesman, Mohammed Abdul Salam, denied in comments to Reuters that the group had agreed to a temporary truce. He's saying, we've only agreed to allow the damaged tanker to be towed away. So on Tuesday, the Pentagon said that the tanker could be leaking oil into the Red Sea and that the Houthis had threatened boats that tried to approach the vessel on that same day, on Tuesday. So this goes to show that the Houthis are continuing their attacks on shipping, which they started in response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. The U.S. bombing campaign has not deterred them. It has only escalated the situation. All right, so the next one here, where am I? U.S. military open to escorting Philippine ships. So this is a concerning story. Well, I guess a lot of them have been so far, but this is Admiral Samuel Paparo. He's the head of U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. He said on Tuesday that the U.S. military was open to consultations with the Philippines on escorting Philippine vessels in the South China Sea, which would put the U.S. in direct confrontation with China. The U.S. has repeatedly vowed that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippine vessels in the South China Sea, which means the U.S. is pledging to intervene and fight China if the maritime dispute turns hot. Philippine vessels often have tense confrontations with the Chinese Coast Guard near disputed reefs in the South China Sea, which sometimes end in collision. Chinese boats have frequently intercepted Philippine vessels as they were attempting to resupply a grounded warship on 2nd Thomas Shoal. So Paparo was asked if the U.S. military would accompany Philippine vessels resupplying Philippine forces in the South China Sea. So he said, quote, certainly within the context of consultations. Every option between the two sovereign nations in terms of our mutual defense escort of one vessel to the other is an entirely reasonable option within our mutual defense treaty among this close alliance between the two of us, end quote. So again, this would put the U.S., whether it's the U.S. Navy escorting them or the U.S. Coast Guard, it would put the U.S. in direct confrontation with Chinese ships, Chinese vessels. And this comes, there's been kind of a spike in tensions. There was the two collisions recently near the Sabina Shoal, and another confrontation there. So it was interesting. The head of the Philippine, Paparo made these comments. He was in Manila, and he was holding a joint press conference with the head of the Philippine military, the Philippine Armed Forces, General Romeo Brawner Jr., and he kind of expressed more caution about the idea. He said, quote, "The attitude of the armed forces of the Philippines as dictated by Philippine laws is for us to first rely on ourselves. We are going to try all the options, all avenues that are available to us in order for us to achieve mission. We will then seek for other options when we are already constrained from doing it ourselves," end quote. So the Philippines doesn't seem super eager for this at the moment. But again, if this is something that starts, China's not going to back down because the U.S. is joining in, I would not think. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. is increasing support for Kenyan operations in Haiti. This article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So the White House is increasing its support for the Kenyan operations in Haiti by sending additional armored vehicles. They're sending 24, and this was announced by U.S. Southern Command on last Friday. They said, quote, "As part of the U.S. government's ongoing support to Haitian-led security efforts in the country, 24 additional MRAPs will be delivered and transferred to Kenyan personnel deployed to Haiti as part of the multinational security support mission. The MSS will add the vehicles to its existing fleet of 10 U.S.-provided MRAPs," end quote. So earlier this year, Kenya sent hundreds of armed troops to the Caribbean nation for what is being called a policing operation. And this intervention has been funded, encouraged by the United States. So now they're adding some more assistance for it. So, I haven't been paying too much attention to what's been happening in Haiti, but there's still been kind of a lot of clashes and everything. Haven't seen too much about what these Kenyan troops have actually done, but it's something I probably should keep an eye on more, considering the U.S. is very involved in this. All right, so the last story here, France issues preliminary charges against Telegram CEO. So on Wednesday, French judicial authorities indicted Telegram CEO Pavel Durov on 6 preliminary charges relating to illicit activity on the messaging app. The case against Durov has sparked a global backlash since charging the head of a tech platform for the activity of its users certainly has chilling implications for free speech. They're charging him for things people did on Telegram, not for anything he did, for the actions of people. I've seen people make this point. It's like arresting the Postmaster General over people sending drugs through the mail, which happens all the time. So one of the preliminary charges is for managing an online platform to allow illicit transactions by an organized group. So it sounds like they're implying that that's like the whole point of this online platform. And that could lead to up to 10 years in prison and a 500,000 euro fine. Durov is also accused of not cooperating with investigations into illegal activity on Telegram. The investigation into Durov is expected to take months or even years, and if judicial authorities don't find enough evidence, they could drop these preliminary charges. So Durov, who's a Russian-born citizen of France and the UAE, was released on a 5 million euro bail on Wednesday. He is not allowed to leave France, and he must check in at a police station twice a week. So the Wall Street Journal had an interesting report on Wednesday. Apparently in 2018, Durov had lunch with French President Emmanuel Macron, who invited Durov to move Telegram, which is based in Abu Dhabi, to Paris. So apparently at one point, Macron wanted Telegram to be based in France. And this report also revealed that in 2017, French spies targeted Durov in a joint operation with the UAE to hack his phone. And that was apparently over some activity of ISIS on Telegram. And I mentioned, in the last story I wrote up about this, I mentioned something interesting that he told Tucker Carlson when he was interviewed by him earlier this year, was that he's faced pressure from the U.S. government. When he's visited the U.S., he says the FBI is always there to greet him. And one of his engineers, the U.S. government officials, tried to hire one of his engineers to get like a back door into Telegram so they can access user data. So the U.S. has certainly had its eye on Telegram and Durov. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Connor O'Keefe: the incursion into Russia will not solve Ukraine's biggest problem. One from Andrew Napolitano: searching for monsters. One from Joe Gill: Kamala Harris's speech killed any hope she would end the Gaza genocide. One from Dennis Simon and Marcus Stanley: why can't we just let American and Chinese scientists get along? One from Bryce Green and Lara Noor Walton: the New York Times uncritically reported Israel's version of Golan bombings. That's over at FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. So please go check all of that out. Go check out our blog. Kyle Anzalone's show, Conflicts of Interest, is in there. Lots of other good stuff. But that is it for me for today. If you want to support this show, support antiwar.com. Share it. Tell your friends about us. Like, subscribe, comment. All that stuff helps out. Follow us on Instagram and on X. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.